Head to Whole Foods Market to jumpstart your January during our New Year boosting event with savings on feel-good favorites store-wide. Save on organic picks, wellness staples, and more all month long.
You are listening to Women's Running Stories, where exceptional women runners share inspirational stories about their running experiences.
My name's Heather Caplan. I'm the co-founder of the Lane 9 Project. I have 3 kids. I'm based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I'm a runner, mostly for fun, almost entirely for fun.
Yes, in this episode, you're going to hear from Heather Caplan, whose running story spans many seasons of her life. And through those seasons, Heather has discovered how wins in her running life can show up in many different ways. Finding joy and satisfaction in running can look really different depending on the time of life that you're in. But before you hear more from Heather, I want to welcome you to Women's Running Stories. I am Cherie Louise Turner. I am the host and producer of this podcast, and I really appreciate you being here. Thank you. A couple notes up top here. I do want to remind you that Women's Running Stories now has a weekly newsletter. It comes out every Thursday, and in it, I share what is new on the podcast, what's happening in my own running and training. I also share thoughts and news and observations about what's going on in running, and I always share a resource from another woman who is creating something that speaks to women in running. It could be a podcast, a blog, a book, a newsletter, a resource that I really like that I think you will like too. The newsletter is on Substack. I'll provide a link in the show notes to how you can find it, or you can go to Substack and do a search for Women's Running Stories. Either way, it'll get you there. Also, Women's Running Stories has a new website. It's a whole new look. It's at the same URL, womensrunningstories.com. And one item I want to highlight right now is that it is now really easy to find our merch. It is right on the homepage. I am particularly fond of the black hoodie with white logo, but there are lots of things in our merch store: mugs, stickers, totes, and there's also clothing, t-shirts, and sweatshirts. Please have a look and get yourself some Women's Running Stories merch. Now, on to Heather Caplan's running story. Heather is a runner. She is a run coach, a dietitian, the mother of 3 children, and she is also well known for being the co-founder of Lane 9 with Alexis Fairbanks. And I'm going to let Heather tell you what Lane 9 is all about.
Lane 9 is a community of athletes and a directory of clinicians and coaches that work with female athletes, and we're all trying to improve menstrual health and reduce REDS across various levels of sport.
So for some clarity here, REDS, also known as RED-S, stands for Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport. It is a syndrome that used to go by the name of the female athlete triad. Some people still refer to it as that or use those terms interchangeably. And one of the big markers for REDS is the loss of a menstrual cycle. This is also called amenorrhea. And this is something that Heather Caplan has personal experience with. She also went through a period of disordered eating, and she is going to get into all of this in her running story. So let's get to it. Let's hear Heather Caplan's story, starting with when her running journey began. Here to tell her story is Heather Caplan.
So I really got into running in college, and that was my preferred form of movement after being an athlete and playing team sports for most of my childhood and throughout high school. I played primarily soccer and also tennis, and running was just a means to an end, and I really did not enjoy it at all. I really did not look forward to any of the days where we had to do like a 3-mile run, or we did like a 2-mile time trial at the start of soccer tryouts. That was like the worst day ever, and just thought running was like never something I would do for fun. And then got to college, and in the absence of a team and the structure of team sports, really did not know what to do with my energy or like how to move in a way that felt good. And this was also the early 2000s. And I feel like it was, if not the height, maybe like a sort of peak of like wellness magazines and content around like movement and exercise. And I just remember reading Fitness Magazine and probably Self and something, I don't know, whatever else was out at the time. And it seemed like running was the thing to be doing. So I got into running as a form of exercise. And for the years that I was in college, I just had a really disordered relationship with food. I wasn't eating enough. I was restricting my intake, trying to control kind of my body and my food intake, and decided to study nutrition, which then for some folks like me can really exacerbate some of those behaviors and symptoms. When I look back on it now with the training and expertise that I have as a clinician, I can see it was somewhat obvious. There was a huge transition going from, being in high school to being in college. I moved across the country. I was in a new state and totally new environment, didn't know anybody, really far from home. And I think I just, at the time, didn't have the skills to really cope with all of that. So instead of seeking out a therapist, which certainly would have been helpful, but didn't even cross my mind as an option as an 18-year-old, I just looked for something that I could control. And that's a really common thing that we see with eating disorders and with athletes. And of course, the overlap of those two things is we don't have a ton of things we can control. And it sometimes feels like that is something that we can control. And so, as a coping mechanism for feeling very overwhelmed with all of the change, that's what I turned to. Of course, that's not true for everybody, but that was what was true for me. And running from my freshman to sophomore and probably part of my junior year felt like this is the thing that will burn the most calories or will be the most intense activity. And that's probably part of why I was doing it. It also just felt like a thing that I knew how to do. Like I could go to like a group fitness class, but I'm like, this feels really out of my comfort zone. I don't want to do it, but I have a pair of running shoes and I know how to go for a run, whether I like it or not. I know how to do that thing. So that was probably also like the lowest barrier to entry for me in terms of movement. Like I've been someone who's gone on a run before, so I could probably do that. So I first noticed that I didn't get a regular period before I went to college. So if I'm remembering correctly, it was the summer before college. And I did not think anything of it at the time. I just was like, oh, that's weird. Like, didn't have a period this month. Doesn't really make sense, but whatever. Like, I'm 18 and about to leave for college. I think probably at the time that was the least of my worries. So that continued for months. And what I remember is going to the student health clinic on campus, probably for some illness. I don't know. For me, I have to be pretty sick to go to a doctor, which is like not something I endorse, but that's just my history of behavior. So I must have been pretty sick, and I went to the student health clinic. And you fill out a form, and as a female or a person who menstruates, the question is, when was your last period? And they're probably trying to parse out if you're pregnant or not. And I put something that was like 6 months before that. And I remember the nurse being like, why haven't you had a period for 6 months? And I was like, I don't know. And she was like, well, are you pregnant? I'm like, no. And she's like, are you sure? I'm like, yes. And that exact interaction, like that conversation just happened over and over for the next couple of years. And I went on and off birth control in college to, like, at the time, that was kind of the first line of defense, like, "Oh, you're not getting a period. That's interesting. Well, do you wanna go on birth control?" And I was like, "I don't okay, sure." And it from what I can remember, it never felt like an extensive conversation. Like, there must have been one provider at some point who thought, "Well, you probably should have a period, so we'll put you on birth control, and that should help." And that was the line of thinking for many, many years with healthcare providers. And I'm sure there are still a lot of providers who use that as a quote unquote treatment for amenorrhea. But birth control pills don't give you a period. You bleed or you shed a little bit, but it's not a period. You may not be ovulating at all. And then you don't really know that because you're on a pill that is, every 3 weeks you take a placebo and you bleed or you shed the uterine lining. So I went on and off of the pills for a couple of years, and I would go off when I felt a little frustrated. Like, I wonder if I am getting a period. I wonder if it's come back yet. So I would kind of just take myself off, and then nothing would happen for a couple months, and I go back on. And again, I'm studying nutrition at the time, and I remember learning about building bone health and how estrogen is a piece of that. And I was like, oh no. So go back on the pills for that. And again, like working with very little information. And I'm a teenager and then, in my early 20s. And that, so from 18 until 24, I didn't have a cycle on my own. So the kind of years in between my freshman and senior year were like studying nutrition and learning it and training to be a dietitian or studying to be a dietitian, and also going through my own process of trying to figure out how to get to a better place in my relationship with food and movement. And then my senior year of college, I ran my first half marathon, and that was inspired by one of my roommates and one of my good friends who had run a marathon the fall of our senior year, the fall semester, which seemed really wild to me. One, just to be running those distances, like did not calculate in my brain as something that like a human body could do. And two, it felt really wild that she found the time to train, and like that was something she wanted to do with her time as a senior in college. But it was inspiring to me, and I didn't have a desire to go that far, but I did some research online and found that there was a half marathon happening in the suburb of Pittsburgh that one of our other roommates was from. And so it felt like kind of a fun way to test out the distance and see how it felt, and also to spend a weekend, the four of us who all lived together, going to Pittsburgh and staying with their family for the weekend. So I signed up for the race, and it was like a month away, but I could probably comfortably run 3 to 4 miles up to that point. And the way I remember structuring my quote unquote training, if you could call it that, was I figured we have 5 weeks until the race. So each Saturday I'll try to run a little bit longer than the Saturday before. And that started with trying to run for an hour. And I have this really clear memory of being in the kitchen of a model apartment that we had to stay in because our apartment was filled with mold. And I remember being in that apartment and having this thought of, well, you're probably not going to be able to run that far or that long if you don't eat enough. Like kind of the basic understanding and all of the training that I had done or studying I had done in nutrition up to that point, at least told my brain, like, you can't do this if your body's malnourished or if you don't have enough energy. And that feels like the first memory I have of kind of wanting things to be different for me and wanting to really figure out or really change course in how I thought about kind of food and nutrition and my body and what I wanted to do with running. And so I feel like, in the absence of training for that half marathon, would that have happened eventually? Sure. But the way that I look back on it, I have that memory of wanting to be able to do that run. And part of that was knowing that my body had to be fueled in order for that to happen. And I think the half marathon my senior year was only doable for me and my body because I was in a better place by that time and was fueling more adequately and better understood nutrition, for better or worse sometimes. But in that case, it was helpful to me, and had done a little bit of learning about sports nutrition. And by that time had better understood, I haven't been getting a period for a couple of years. That's actually not good. So as a senior in college with more of that knowledge and sort of better equipped to navigate some of what I was experiencing, I see that half marathon as sort of a turning point for me, and certainly was a catalyst for many, many races to come. So I did my makeshift running program and somehow got through that race totally fine and actually had a great time. I felt like I was fit enough to do it. I ran the whole time. I was like, this was great. And so totally had a bug for half marathons after that. I ran another one over the summer, I think at that point, I had found a copy of Runner's World at a hospital. I was working at a hospital over the summer, and hospitals have magazines everywhere. And so I was like walking around, saw a magazine that said Runner's World. I'm like, that seems interesting. I'll pick that up. And then I remember spending all of my downtime at the hospital scouring the magazine collections for more copies of Runner's World and just like tearing through those magazines, soaking it all up. So I think for my second half marathon, I used a training program from the magazine or maybe online. I don't know. And so I think I followed some sort of actual training plan for the second one over the summer. I ran in Bryce Canyon. Was the summer marathon? Yeah, I think it was a half marathon in Bryce Canyon and then in Utah. And then moved to Maryland for my dietetic internship that fall and signed up for the Baltimore half marathon. I struggled through that one. I remember feeling like I just didn't have a lot of gas in the tank and I felt pretty depleted. And in hindsight, that's not super surprising. I moved across the country again, was living with someone I'd never met before to complete my dietetic internship. We were in the same program, was adjusting to internship life versus college life, and, was navigating a lot of change again. So I was probably maybe a little overtrained, a little undernourished for that one. And then went back the following spring to run the same half marathon that I ran in college in Pittsburgh. So the following year, ran it again. And then that summer, I moved to DC and I hooked up with this running group, just wanting to have a way to meet people. And also, I just remember thinking, I want to go for a run. I live in this city and I have no idea where to go. And so I looked up some running groups, found one that met in my neighborhood, and then also one that met on the National Mall every Tuesday and Thursday. And I just thought that was pretty cool. So ran with that group and then just met people through that, and then joined a Saturday group from that cohort of people. And again, this was the fall of 2009, I guess. And next thing I know, everyone's talking about the spring marathon that they're signing up for. And I was like, oh, we do spring marathons. Okay, cool. Yeah, I could do that. So signed up for the race just to train with my friends, and remember thinking, like, if I'm going to do this, I have to be smart. I don't want to injure myself. I don't want my body to be struggling to get through these runs. And I went off. I must have been on the pill at some point in that process and decided to go off. And I remember getting my period like a week or two before the marathon. And I was like, oh my gosh. So 6 years that I was amenorrheic. And in those 6 years, the most the most extensive conversation that I had with a healthcare provider during that time was, I asked, will this impact my fertility later in life? And I just remember the person saying, yeah, I don't know. But if you want to go on a pill, like, I'm happy to write you a prescription. I was like, okay, that was it. So I signed up for the DC, at the time it was called the DC National Marathon and Half. Now, a couple years after that, it got acquired by Rock and Roll. So I think it's still owned by the Rock and Roll franchise. So yeah, and the training plans that I used during those early years were all from Runner's World. I would just go online. They had a tool where you could type in your average pace, the time you were wanting to run for your race, the race you were running, how many weeks you had. And then I remember printing out like a training plan from their website. I mean, I truly had no idea what I was doing. All I knew was, like, I run 5 miles twice a week with this group, and then we run 10 miles on Saturday. And I'm like, well, 10 miles is not 26 miles. So got to figure out what I'm doing to bridge the gap between those two things. Like, I don't remember thinking, oh, I want to run this time, or I want to try to get to this pace. Like, mostly I was trying to keep up with this group of people who were older than me for the most part. There were a couple of folks who were my age, but it was mostly like runners who were a bit older than me and who seemed to have done many races, and they had their own goals. And then I was like, oh, people try to like run each one faster. Okay, well, that's interesting. Like, I guess I'll try to do that, and then this was also kind of the start of like running blogs and like quote unquote healthy living blogs. So I remember reading quite a bit of those and like getting interested. And I started my own blog. And then from there, when I signed up for this marathon, I remember people commenting like, oh, you're probably going to qualify for Boston. And I was like, what does that mean? Like, what are it's like I had no idea. And then I kind of got in my head, well, people think that I'm going to qualify for Boston, then I probably should. And so I do remember my first marathon being really disappointed with my time, but that's the first race I can remember running where I felt really disappointed. And it was because I did not qualify for Boston, whatever the standard was at that time, who knows. But I didn't qualify for my age group and I was really bummed about it. And I'm like, I didn't even know what this meant like 2 months ago. Why do I care about this? And then for the next couple of years, I just ran much more consistently. I had a friend that I met up with a couple times a week that I met at that running group who was my age and also went to Penn State. Like we had a lot of things in common. And we used to meet up and run 5 or 6 times a week together. And she was a bit faster than me and had done club cross country. And so she was always pushing me a little bit like, oh, we could go a little faster. We could do this route a little bit different. Like we could go a little longer. I was like, oh, okay, whatever. Just like along for the ride. But I did get faster. And I had a couple of years where running, I would set goals for races and I would meet them. I would just like surprise myself with how well I was doing. And then there were a couple of years where I moved and met my now husband and we moved to California together and we did a lot of trail running and we did some marathons and like had some fun with it, but I didn't put as much pressure on it at the time. I do remember I wanted to qualify for Boston again and I did that. So like had some quote unquote success or like had some runs where I felt like, okay, I was in my late 20s then. I'm like, okay, I'm still getting faster. Like this is still really fun. But then like really fast forward and I had 3 kids like within 4 years. And my youngest kid now is 3.5. And it's been a real roller coaster like the last 3.5 years, finding some sort of sweet spot with running, if that even existed. For a while, it didn't feel like it existed. Now I do feel like I've kind of gotten there, but life happens and we go through a lot of things. And running has been an anchor for me, but also a thing that has kind of consistently challenged me to check in with myself because it is that thing that's always been there or has been there for a long time. It's too easy to fall into this trap of like, well, it should always feel the same, even if everything in my life is different. And it doesn't always feel the same. And it is one of those things that changes right along with us. And I feel like it often, in a really humbling way, can offer me some perspective on like, how am I really doing? Or, like, where am I overdoing it? Does something need to give? It's sort of a mirror, I guess, in a way that kind of reflects some of what's going on in my life, whether I want it to or not. So I came back to running after our first was born. He was born in 2018. And I really luckily got connected with this workout group for moms in the DC area that I was a little hesitant to join because it was mostly like a high intensity interval training, kind of strength based workout, which is like not what I gravitate towards, but I just needed somewhere to go where other people had really young kids. And so when I was cleared to exercise, I started doing that again and then realized there were some folks in the group who enjoyed running. And most of the people that I had run with before, even though I was back in the DC area, I just didn't feel like that group was accessible to me. I mean, I'm sure they would have welcomed me back, but it felt hard to get into DC on a Saturday morning and to wake up early and to do these long runs. And I also was navigating what was uncharted territory for me. I didn't really know what postpartum running was going to look like. I waited, I think, 3 months before I started running again, started working with a coach, Mary Johnson from Lift Run Perform, who I love, and ended up coaching me for many years after that through each subsequent postpartum season. And I do feel like after my first, I got back to a place with running where it did feel really fun. I did some races with that group, like with some folks in that group. We did some runs together. I was working with Mary, which was I had worked with a coach before, but I remember just really enjoying the workouts she was giving me. It was super challenging. I remember being very sleep deprived and having a lot of days where I'm like, I barely slept 3 hours. Like I'm not going for a run, even though it's on my schedule. So it was navigating, what does it look like to kind of meet yourself where you are in this season? But I do remember my fitness feeling pretty great. Like a year out, I ran a half that felt really good and I felt really fit and had gotten some speed back, and then did a couple more halves before I got pregnant with our second. And I was really enjoying it and having fun with it. I didn't have a desire to do a marathon, which kind of surprised me. But again, I was like, well, I'll just, if that desire comes back to me, I'll sign up for a marathon. But in the meantime, it's not what I want to do. And my second pregnancy, our second was born in 2020. And we moved to Colorado from DC, and so we didn't know anybody, and it was the pandemic, and I had a newborn and a 2-year-old and kind of a recipe for disaster, to be honest. It was a really tough season. And then our third, I got pregnant with really quickly after our second was born. So I had just started running again and then found out I was pregnant again. And so it took kind of another like 9 months off, probably 12 altogether. And when I started running again after our third was born, again, we were in Colorado, and I did not have a running community. You know, we had some friends by that point, but I did not have a running community. And yes, I could have gone to group runs and I could have found a running community, but my capacity at that time was so low that just like anything outside of my very limited kind of comfort zone was not happening. I had to just kind of keep everything at like the lowest bar. So like, can I leave from my house and do a few miles? Sure. But like, am I going to go to a group where I don't know anybody and I might not be able to keep up and they're going to do a route I don't know? Like, I wasn't in a place where I could do that. So for a couple of years, it just felt like this is a thing that I'm going to keep doing because it's important to me and I want to feel sort of connected to the running space. But I really felt like I was kind of on the outside from where I had been before. Like I wasn't going to groups, even though I'm sure that would have been helpful. I just didn't have the capacity to do it. And I wasn't really signing up for races. And then the races I did sign up for and run, I was like, oh God, this is so humbling. And because my experience after my first was that I felt really good about a year in, I expected that to happen with my third, even though, of course, in hindsight, I'm like, well, that was kind of silly, but you only know what you know. And so I remember being about a year out from our third and thinking, like, why do I still feel like my fitness is just not there, or it's not where I kind of hoped it would be? And again, running continues to offer this opportunity to kind of reflect on where you are and to be gentle with yourself. And I say that knowing like that's almost never easy to do, but it is something that kind of, at least for me, has been a forcing agent for like checking in with myself. And I just remember leaving so many workout comments for Mary. Like, I just need a win. I need a workout that feels good. I want a race that feels good. And I had little things kind of here and there, but I kind of kept moving the goalpost. And it was really not until this year, and he's 3.5 now. Then by this year, I mean 2024, where I was like, oh, I'm feeling good. Like I'm kind of settling into a group with running. I'm not running paces that I used to, but I'm getting closer. And like, even if I don't get to that, like I have found some ways in which like running is satisfying to me now. And I have friends that I run with again, and I'm kind of reconnecting with it in a way that is meaningful for me. If I go back to my first experience with postpartum running, I really had such low expectations. Like, I didn't think I would ever get back to where I had been before, and I was perfectly fine with that. Like, really, I can say that like I wanted to do races and I wanted to do longer distances, but I was not really in a rush, and I just sort of trusted like I'll be where I am, and I don't know, I guess I'll find out what that looks like. And then I ran this half marathon just under a year postpartum, and I felt so good that I was like, whoa, maybe I could be fast again. Like maybe I could get back to some of those times. And so that prompted a couple of races. I knew that we would try to get pregnant again. So I kind of felt like I had this limited time frame, and I did a couple of races, and I really specifically remember setting the goal to just go hard. I did not have a time goal. I wasn't like, I want to finish. I did a half marathon and a 10 miler that spring, and both of those races I had run before. And I was not interested at all in running the times that I had run them in before. But what I was curious about was, can I remember what it feels like to race again? Because I felt like that was the piece that was kind of missing for me. And I ran this 10 miler in the spring, and I was like puke threshold like almost the whole time, which like don't recommend necessarily for a 10 miler, but I was so happy. I ended that race and I was like, I did it. Like I made it hard the whole time and I kept going. And that was really the only thing I set out to do that day, was to remind myself, like, you can go hard. It doesn't matter what hard looks like or what it actually feels like or the pace that it translates to, but you can go hard. And that's part of what you love about running, is that it pushes you a little bit. So I like really took that experience and kept it with me. And I think where I landed on the other side of the next two kids coming back to running was that I was overall not in a great place. I didn't love where we were living. It still felt pretty lonely. Like we met some friends, but I didn't have running friends. I didn't have a running community. And so I think part of my frustration with running at the time was like, it just wasn't serving me in the ways that I hoped that it would. And then when we moved to Michigan last summer, I really was like, okay, I'm ready to find some friends. I need some running buddies. And I eventually found two friends, one in our neighborhood and one our kids go to the same daycare. And we run together pretty often. And like, that's been a huge game changer for me. Like it feels, what part of what running serves for me right now is it gives me some community. It gives me some time with friends. And I love that. I've tried going to some group runs, which I really enjoy. I haven't gone as consistently as I would like, but I'm trying to remember that it's not, for me, like for a really long time, it has not been about times that I'm running in these races or events or even the pace I'm doing on a weekly basis, but am I finding ways that I can build community around running? Because that's always been really important to me, and what feels fun about it. And the races that I did in 2024, one, I had a time goal and I didn't hit it. And it was super disappointing. And I was like, wow, this is a lesson. I just have to keep learning, I guess. When that's the main goal, it's not as fun for me. And I signed up for a half marathon right before the end of the calendar year in 2024. And it was like totally on a whim. I truly, as a person who is a running coach, I would say I had no business signing up for this half marathon. If I had a coach at the time and had like run this by them, they probably would have been like, maybe not the best idea, but if you want to, I guess. But I saw that it was happening and I had been really frustrated by kind of both like how I approached that half marathon in the spring and also by my overall experience. Like it was just kind of frustrating all around. I didn't feel good. I didn't have a good day. And then I was bummed. And I'm like, why did I, what I could have gone in a little with a slightly different attitude. And so anyway, I saw this half marathon in December and was like, I feel like I just want to rewrite a script from this year. And this gives me the opportunity to do that. Am I trained to run a half marathon? No, not really. But I've done it on less training and my body knows what to do. I've run so many half marathons over the last 15 years. And my goal was not a time, it was not a pace, it was a feeling. And it wasn't even a feeling of going hard. I just wanted to run 13.1 miles and enjoy it in some way, shape, or form. And that's exactly what I did. And I actually felt great and had such a good time and ended and was like, I feel so satisfied. I was really pumped, honestly. I mean, like, the time on the clock ended up being faster than I've run a half marathon in over 5 years. Not by a lot, but that was like, I didn't even look at my watch. Like when people say that, I'm like, yes, you did. And I'm like, I really didn't. Like I didn't. I was like, it was so cold. I was so bundled up. I was like, I don't know what pace I'm running, but like, it doesn't matter because I feel pretty good. And I'm just going to keep trying to feel good and enjoy this and not feel like I am slowly, trying to like, I didn't want to feel like I was kind of in the death march to the end, which the two races that I ran last year in the spring felt like that. So again, the bar was pretty low, but I ended up having a great time in like all the ways. So it was wonderful. So yeah, it's just been a shift in like what are the things about running that are important to me, and what are the ways that it serves me, and how can I kind of keep reminding myself of that, because it is so easy to fall into, past paces, past times, past experiences. And so again, it's just like kind of this constant reminder of like, this is where I am now, and this is what's fun about running for me now in this season.
Defining for herself what is fun and rewarding about running today in this season of life. While it is easy to get caught up in paces and times and former versions of ourselves, I've done it too, and it is so much more fun and satisfying to work with where we're at today. So thank you, Heather, for that reminder. I know for myself, frequent reminders about this are very helpful. That does bring us to the end of Heather Caplan's story on the podcast. Thank you so much, Heather, for coming on the podcast and sharing your running story, and also for sharing your experiences about overcoming disordered eating and the importance of menstrual health. If you are of childbearing years and you are a person who menstruates and you are missing your period, please go talk to a professional. And you can also go check out Lane 9 and learn more about menstrual health as well as REDS. They have loads of resources. Please look to the show notes for links to Lane 9 as well as other ways to keep up with Heather Caplan. And again, you will also find links to the Women's Running Stories newsletter as well as our newly redesigned website. That is going to do it for me. Thank you so much for being here and listening. I always appreciate it. I am Cherie Louise Turner. I'm the host and producer of Women's Running Stories. And until next Tuesday, I do wish you healthy, joyful strides forward. Women's Running. Women's Running Stories.
Running should be simple. Just put on your shoes and go. And yet, when you try to learn about how to get better at it, especially as you age, you're confronted with conflicting advice, complicated workouts, and confusing nutrition trends that just won't work for you. On The Planted Runner, I'll share exactly how to run faster, longer, and feel great doing it at any age, because you don't have time to waste. I'm Coach Claire Bartholic, and I went from not running at all in my late 30s to finishing a marathon in 2:58 at age 42, all on a plant-based diet. I've helped hundreds of runners achieve new personal records well into their 60s and even 70s with science-backed training, plant-based nutrition, and proven mental strength techniques. Each episode of The Planted Runner is like a private coaching session on the run, where you'll learn from me and the guests I interview. You'll get actionable lessons to help you become a better runner every week and reach goals that you never thought possible. Whether you're training for your first 5K or your 50th marathon, take along The Planted Runner on your next run. Let me show you how your best running is still ahead of you.